Bet you $50 I can make him crack?" These were the words Kevin Reynolds whispered to his friends as he approached the motionless figure of Royal Guard Thomas Blackwood. Reynolds, backed by Texas oil money and a lifetime of privilege, had no idea he was about to face a decorated veteran with 8 years of service and 2 Afghanistan tours. In seconds, Reynolds would commit an act so vile that it would spark international outrage and legal consequences he never saw coming. What happened next would be captured from every angle and change everything. If you're as shocked as we were, make sure to like the video. Don't forget to subscribe for more unbelievable moments and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. Dozens of phones recorded the moment from multiple angles when Kevin Reynolds made his fatal mistake. The August afternoon heat shimmered off the palace gates as tourists held their devices high, capturing what they thought would be another harmless encounter with the stoic guards. Reynolds had been circling Blackwood for about 17 minutes, testing boundaries with increasingly bold gestures, while his wealthy friends documented every move from their position near the ornate railings. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Reynolds stepped closer to Guard Blackwood, his friends cheering him on from behind with voices that carried the careless confidence of men who had never faced real consequences. Reynolds wore a designer polo shirt that cost more than most people earned in a week, and his Rolex caught the sunlight as he raised his hands in mock surrender before moving within arm's reach of the motionless figure. The tourists around them sensed something was building, but none could have predicted the line Reynolds was about to cross. Time seemed to slow as Reynolds gathered saliva in his mouth, his eyes locked on the motionless guard, who had no idea what was coming next. Blackwood stood at perfect attention, his rifle held at the precise angle drilled into him through years of ceremony and service. The red tunic bore not a single wrinkle despite the sweltering temperature, and his bearskin hat cast a shadow across features that revealed nothing of the decorated soldier beneath the uniform. Reynolds paused for a moment, savoring what he believed would be his moment of triumph over authority and tradition. The spit landed just below Blackwood's right eye, a deliberate act of humiliation that crossed every line of human decency and respect. The thick saliva clung to the guard's cheek, glistening in the afternoon sun, as gasps erupted from the surrounding crowd. Reynolds stepped back with his arms raised in victory, as if he had just conquered some great challenge rather than committed an assault against a man bound by duty to remain motionless. Multiple cameras captured the exact moment when a prank became a crime, showing Reynolds' smug satisfaction immediately after his vile act. His friends whooped and applauded behind him, apparently unaware that they were documenting what would become the most expensive $50 in Reynolds' privileged life. The high-definition footage would soon become evidence in courtrooms and viral content across every social media platform. Blackwood remained perfectly still, his training taking over even as the crowd gasped, and phones captured every second of his extraordinary restraint. Not a single muscle in his face twitched despite the humiliation streaming down his cheek. His breathing stayed controlled and measured exactly as he had been taught during his military service when enemy fighters had tried far worse tactics to break his concentration. The spit began to drip from his jaw, but Blackwood's eyes stayed fixed straight ahead as if Reynolds had never existed. The tourists fell silent, realizing they had witnessed something that went far beyond harmless fun. Parents quickly pulled their children away, understanding instinctively that this moment would have consequences none of them wanted to be associated with. Everyone expected a reaction, but not this one. What happened in those crucial seconds after the spit hit would determine whether Blackwood broke his oath or proved his worth as one of the most disciplined soldiers in the British military. The guard's response in that moment would define not just his character, but spark a global conversation about dignity under fire. Reynolds stood there waiting for some reaction that would justify his cruel behavior, but Blackwood gave him nothing except perfect stillness. But the real shock came when palace security arrived and gave Blackwood permission to do something no one expected him to have the authority to do. What Reynolds didn't realize was that he hadn't just targeted any ordinary guard standing at his post. Thomas Blackwood carried 8 years of military service and 2 Afghanistan deployments in steady hands that had held rifles in combat zones where the stakes were life and death. While Reynolds saw just another costume statue standing motionless for tourist entertainment, he had chosen someone whose strength came from places his money could never buy. The wealthy Texan had spent decades targeting service workers, waiters, hotel staff, and anyone he perceived as beneath his social status. But this time was different. The difference between them went deeper than uniform and ceremony, reaching into the very core of what each man believed about duty, honor, and sacrifice. Every morning, Blackwood spent 3 meticulous hours preparing his uniform because he understood what Reynolds never could, that some symbols are worth defending with your life. The red tunic had to be pressed to perfection, every button polished until it gleamed, and every piece of ceremonial equipment positioned exactly as regulations demanded. This wasn't vanity, but respect for something greater than himself. His military record told a story of courage under fire, earning commendations that sat quietly in his modest London flat, far from the spotlight Reynolds craved so desperately. Each decoration represented moments when he had chosen duty over safety, service over comfort, and his comrades over himself. Reynolds collected expensive watches and luxury cars, but Blackwood collected the respect of people who mattered. The 29-year-old guard had faced Taliban fighters in Helmand province, where real bullets tested his resolve, not just tourist cameras and entitled Americans with too much money. In one firefight that left scars on his shoulder, Blackwood had held his position while mortars exploded around him, making life-or-death decisions in seconds when everything else fell apart. The enemy had tried psychological warfare and direct threats, but he had never wavered from his mission. "I took an oath," Blackwood had once explained to a fellow soldier. His oath to the crown wasn't just ceremonial words recited for show, but a promise sealed by years of sacrifice and service to something greater than himself. The oath meant something because he had proven it in places where promises were tested by enemy fire and extreme conditions that stripped away everything except character. Reynolds had never sworn an oath to anything except his own pleasure and profit. Blackwood's fellow soldiers knew him as someone who never broke under pressure, a man whose word meant everything in situations where promises kept people alive. During his second deployment, squad members had learned they could count on him to hold his position no matter what chaos erupted around them. He had carried wounded comrades to safety under enemy fire and volunteered for the most dangerous patrols without complaint. The bonds forged in combat created loyalties that civilian life could never match. What Reynolds mistook for weakness was actually the kind of strength that only comes from facing real danger and choosing duty over comfort when every instinct screams for self-preservation. The stillness that Reynolds thought he could break had been forged in combat zones where movement meant death and discipline meant survival. His composure had been earned through experiences that would have left Reynolds crying for his lawyers. Blackwood's restraint came not from rules or fear of punishment, but from inner strength that had been tested against genuine threats to his life and country. His uniform connected him to generations of soldiers who had died defending the values he now represented at Buckingham Palace. This wasn't just any guard Reynolds had chosen to humiliate, but a decorated veteran who understood the true weight of what he wore and what it represented to people who had served their country with honor. But Reynolds had no understanding of any of this. The man approaching with his cruel bet had lived an entirely different kind of life, one where consequences were always someone else's problem and respect was something you could buy rather than earn. Kevin Reynolds had been shaped by Texas oil money and a lifetime of insulation from accountability. Palace security footage would later reveal he had spent over an hour testing the guards with increasingly aggressive provocations before making his $50 bet. His family's donations and influence had repeatedly shielded him from consequences throughout his privileged life, creating a man who believed wealth could overcome any obstacle or social boundary. Born into billions generated across 3 generations, Reynolds had reached his mid-30s without ever facing real punishment for his actions. Private school administrators had looked the other way when he bullied classmates, and university officials had accepted generous family donations instead of expelling him for academic dishonesty. Every mistake became a lesson not about right and wrong, but about how much money it took to make problems disappear completely. The Dallas Country Club elite had watched Reynolds escalate from rude comments to public scenes, but his family's contributions always smoothed things over before anyone faced consequences. Board members who witnessed his verbal abuse of waitstaff would shake their heads privately but never confront him directly, knowing the Reynolds family contributed more to club renovations than most members paid in decades of dues. His behavior towards service workers became legendary among staff who learned to endure his tantrums because complaining meant losing jobs they couldn't afford to lose. Reynolds and his wealthy friends had turned their European vacation into a game of pushing boundaries, seeing how far their money and status could take them when dealing with foreign customs and authorities. They had already tested limits at exclusive London establishments, making scenes that resulted in comp meals and profuse apologies from managers who feared negative reviews from influential Americans. Each success reinforced their belief that wealth was a universal language that could overcome any cultural barrier or social expectation. The $50 bet with his friends wasn't just about money, but about proving that his privilege could break even the most disciplined person and demonstrate his superiority over symbols of authority he didn't respect. Reynolds had spent his entire life breaking people who couldn't fight back, from waiters to hotel clerks to anyone whose job required them to smile and take abuse from wealthy customers. The bet represented his belief that everyone had a price or breaking point that his money and status could exploit. What Reynolds never understood was that some people can't be bought, intimidated, or broken because their strength comes from something deeper than fear of consequences or desire for financial reward. His wealth had always been his shield, protecting him from accountability and allowing him to treat others as entertainment for his cruel amusement. He had made increasingly aggressive moves toward the motionless guards, starting with simple gestures and escalating to more direct provocations when those tactics failed to provoke reactions. This time, Reynolds was about to discover that money can't protect you from the consequences of crossing certain lines, especially when those lines involve assaulting decorated military veterans in front of international audiences. The moment his spit left his mouth, Reynolds had unknowingly declared war on centuries of tradition and a legal system that doesn't care about your bank account when determining guilt and punishment. But what happened next would prove that Reynolds had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the man standing before him. The wealthy Texan expected either silence or anger from his victim, but Palace security was about to grant permission for something that would transform this moment from simple assault into something far more profound. Guard Captain Harrison stepped forward and gave a subtle nod that every trained soldier recognized as authorization to break protocol. Blackwood saluted his superior and stepped closer to Reynolds, wiping the spit from his cheek with deliberate calm before addressing the crowd that had pressed forward, sensing something unprecedented was about to happen. Reynolds smirked, expecting either silence or anger. But what came next was something his privileged world had never prepared him for. The wealthy Texan had spent his entire life provoking reactions from people who couldn't fight back, but Blackwood represented a different kind of person entirely. His confident expression began to waver as the guard's measured voice cut through the summer air. Blackwood's opening words made it clear that his uniform wasn't a costume, but a symbol Reynolds could never comprehend. His voice stayed level and controlled as he explained what the red tunic and bearskin hat actually represented to those who had earned the right to wear them. The guard made it clear that this wasn't just about ceremony or tradition, but about values that had been tested in places where real sacrifice was required. He spoke of his military service with factual precision rather than boastful pride, referencing experiences that had shaped his understanding of duty and honor in ways Reynolds could never imagine. The combat veteran had endured mortar attacks and the loss of fellow soldiers, while Reynolds had never faced anything more challenging than delayed room service. Blackwood's discipline came not from rules or fear, but from respect for institutions and values that transcended personal comfort. The guard explained that enduring heat, cold, and provocation was part of guarding something bigger than any one person, including himself, and certainly including Reynolds. His words transformed the incident from simple tourist misbehavior into a lesson about what real strength looks like when tested by those who mistake restraint for weakness. Every word was measured and deliberate, turning the crowd's attention from Reynolds' crude behavior to the deeper meaning of duty and sacrifice. Children stopped asking questions, and adults lowered their cameras, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something important. Blackwood made it clear that this wasn't about personal revenge, but about defending the principles that hold a nation together and ensuring that symbols of service weren't treated as props for wealthy tourists. His speech elevated the conversation above petty provocation to address fundamental questions about respect, tradition, and what people owe to those who serve them. By the time Blackwood delivered his closing words, Reynolds had visibly shrunk under the weight of the moment. "I don't expect an apology," the guard said with quiet authority, "but I do hope that someday you'll understand what happened here." His final sentence carried the moral weight of everything that had transpired, transforming Reynolds from aggressor to cautionary tale about what happens when privilege meets principle and discovers that some things cannot be bought or bullied. The crowd's silence said everything as they realized they had witnessed not just an assault, but a profound lesson in what real strength looks like when faced with deliberate provocation and disrespect. Phones that had been recording the incident were forgotten in hands that hung limply at their sides. Even Reynolds' friends ceased their nervous shuffling as the gravity of the moment settled over everyone present. What none of them realized in that moment of stunned quiet was that those same phones had already captured everything, and the footage was about to escape their control entirely. Within minutes, dozens of camera phones had uploaded footage that would make Kevin Reynolds one of the most hated men on the internet and transform his cruel prank into evidence that millions would examine frame by frame. The high-definition videos captured every detail from multiple angles, showing Reynolds' smug expression as the spit landed on Blackwood's face and his victory celebration that followed the assault. Tourist phones automatically backed up to cloud storage, ensuring the footage spread faster than any damage control team could contain it. Social media algorithms recognized the engagement patterns and pushed the content to wider audiences, creating an unstoppable wave of visibility that reached every corner of the internet. The platform systems amplified the reach beyond anything Reynolds' family had ever faced, as users shared the videos with commentary that grew more outraged with each repost. The hashtag #RespectTheGuard began trending worldwide within the hour, accompanied by posts demanding accountability and justice for the assault. TikTok creators used the original footage to make reaction videos that racked up millions of views, turning Reynolds into a global symbol of entitled behavior. Veterans groups shared the footage with commentary about what Blackwood's restraint meant to those who had served alongside men like him in combat zones where discipline meant survival. British tabloids picked up the story, turning Reynolds into a symbol of American arrogance and disrespect for centuries-old traditions that represented the foundation of British identity. The Daily Mail and The Sun ran front-page stories with headlines that painted Reynolds as everything wrong with wealthy American tourists who treated foreign customs as entertainment. LinkedIn posts from business leaders condemned Reynolds' behavior, with some calling for boycotts of any company associated with his family's oil empire. The viral spread wasn't just about the spitting, it was about everything Reynolds represented and everything Blackwood stood for in that moment of truth when character revealed itself under pressure. Social media users saw the incident as a perfect example of privilege meeting principle, with clear winners and losers in the court of public opinion. The contrast between Reynolds' cruelty and Blackwood's dignity created a narrative that resonated across cultural and political lines. Comment sections filled with personal stories from people who had served their countries and understood the weight of what they had witnessed in those crucial seconds at Buckingham Palace. Veterans described their own experiences with discipline under pressure, sharing how Blackwood's restraint represented values they had sworn to defend. Military families explained to civilian audiences why the assault felt personal to anyone who had worn a uniform in service to their nation. Among the thousands of messages of support was a letter from a 9-year-old girl that captured what many adults struggled to express. "Dear Guard Blackwood," she wrote in careful handwriting, "my daddy says the strongest thing is to be kind and respectful even when people are mean to you." Her innocent words somehow distilled the entire incident into a lesson about character that resonated with readers around the world. The global conversation expanded beyond the original incident to include discussions about wealth accountability, respect for service members, and the power of social media to deliver swift justice. International news outlets picked up the story, creating a worldwide dialogue about privilege and consequences that reached far beyond the original tourist audience at Buckingham Palace. By the end of the first day, Reynolds had become an international pariah, while Blackwood was being hailed as a hero of restraint and dignity, whose response had elevated a moment of personal humiliation into a lesson about character. The internet had rendered its verdict with overwhelming clarity, but what Reynolds didn't yet understand was that viral shame would be the least of his problems. Real consequences were already in motion as authorities began examining the crystal-clear evidence that millions had already seen and judged. Detective Inspector Sarah Matthews opened the case file knowing she had more evidence than most criminal investigations ever receive. The Metropolitan Police had collected footage from 17 different phones that captured every angle of the assault, along with palace security cameras that recorded Reynolds' escalating behavior throughout the afternoon. The videos showed Reynolds gathering saliva, deliberately aiming at Blackwood's face, and celebrating afterward with clear audio of his friends cheering the attack, demonstrating premeditation rather than spontaneous action. The Crown Prosecution Service moved quickly, filing common assault charges that carried potential jail time of up to 6 months imprisonment and unlimited fines regardless of Reynolds' wealth or American citizenship. Prosecutor James Wellington argued that the assault represented more than personal violence, but an attack on British institutions and military service members who deserved legal protection. British courts had prosecuted similar cases involving tourists who thought their foreign status provided immunity from local laws, but discovered otherwise in London courtrooms. Reynolds' expensive legal team immediately realized their client faced serious criminal charges that his family fortune couldn't dismiss or reduce through financial influence. The high-powered London barristers discovered that British law doesn't distinguish between spitting on ordinary citizens and assaulting military personnel, as the penalties remained identical either way. Previous cases involving wealthy foreigners had established clear precedent that money provided no protection from criminal prosecution when evidence was overwhelming. Reynolds' family wealth became a prosecutorial weapon as his privileged background made his actions even more inexcusable and demonstrated contempt for values his money couldn't buy. The prosecution presented evidence of his lifestyle, including social media posts showing expensive vacations and luxury purchases that highlighted his disconnect from ordinary consequences. Wellington argued that someone with Reynolds' advantages should understand basic respect for military service, making his assault more deliberate and offensive to British values. His Dallas Country Club connections meant nothing in Judge Patricia Thornton's courtroom, where entitled tourists had faced appropriate legal consequences before without regard for their financial status. The courtroom atmosphere made clear that Reynolds' American passport and family fortune carried no weight in determining guilt or punishment for criminal behavior captured on crystal-clear video evidence. Judge Thornton had seen wealthy foreigners attempt to buy their way out of British justice and knew exactly how to handle such cases. Judge Thornton sentenced Reynolds to 200 hours of mandatory community service at veterans organizations designed to force him to confront the values he had ridiculed by working with disabled veterans and military families. The sentence required Reynolds to spend time with people who had sacrificed far more for their countries than he had ever contributed to anything beyond his own pleasure and entertainment. The community service wasn't just punishment, but education about what genuine service actually means to those who understand duty and sacrifice. Asset freezing orders immediately hit his accounts, while sponsorship deals evaporated and business partnerships dissolved overnight as companies distanced themselves from his toxic reputation. The Reynolds family oil company faced boycott threats that affected partnerships with international firms as his personal endorsement deals with luxury brands terminated within days of his conviction. The man who thought $50 was worth humiliating a decorated veteran now faced legal bills exceeding £200,000 that drained his trust fund, while civil litigation promised additional financial consequences stretching for years. His defense costs, combined with lost sponsorships and dissolved partnerships, left him with significantly diminished financial status and a reputation that no amount of money could repair. Reynolds learned that some actions have consequences that wealth, privilege, and family connections cannot undo through financial influence or social status. But the legal consequences for one entitled tourist were just the beginning of something much larger that would ripple far beyond any London courtroom. Thomas Blackwood's moment of restraint transformed from viral entertainment into educational content that military leaders, police trainers, and business schools would study for years to come. What started as documentation of tourist misbehavior evolved into a masterclass in leadership under pressure that resonated across professions and cultures worldwide. Military academies worldwide began using footage of Blackwood's response to teach cadets about maintaining authority through character rather than force. The United States Military Academy at West Point incorporated the incident into their ethics curriculum, using Blackwood's composure to demonstrate how disciplined soldiers respond to deliberate attempts at humiliation. British military training facilities used the footage to show recruits the difference between reactive anger and controlled response, emphasizing how Blackwood's restraint actually demonstrated more power than any physical retaliation could have achieved. Police training programs adopted Blackwood's measured response as an example of de-escalation under extreme provocation, showing officers how to maintain professional standards when facing deliberate attempts to provoke reactions. Law enforcement academies studied the guards' controlled breathing, steady posture, and measured words as textbook examples of how to handle hostile encounters without escalating violence. Training instructors emphasized how Blackwood's military discipline translated perfectly to civilian law enforcement situations where officers faced similar challenges from people trying to goad them into inappropriate responses. Business schools used Reynolds' fall as a case study in reputation destruction in the social media era, illustrating how personal behavior can destroy professional relationships and family legacies built over generations. Universities showed students how quickly reputation could be destroyed and how wealth provided no protection from the consequences of character failures captured on camera. Students learned through Reynolds' example that in a connected world, personal conduct and professional success were inseparably linked, making character development as important as technical skills for career advancement. Tourist behavior at Buckingham Palace shifted noticeably as visitors became more aware of the history and sacrifice behind the ceremonial uniforms they had previously treated as entertainment props. The shallow jokes about making guards react were replaced by genuine interest in the traditions they represented as parents explained to children the significance of military service and ceremonial duty. Visitors began approaching the guards with visible respect, understanding that these weren't actors in costumes, but decorated soldiers whose restraint represented years of training and commitment to something greater than themselves. Veterans organizations reported increased donations and volunteer applications as people sought to honor the values Blackwood had demonstrated during those crucial moments at Buckingham Palace. Military charities saw spikes in support as civilians recognized the difference between ceremonial duty and the combat experience that shaped guards like Blackwood who had earned their positions through service in actual war zones. The incident became a modern lesson in restraint, accountability, and the limits of privilege. The story resonated because it showed someone with genuine strength choosing not to use it against someone whose only power came from inherited wealth and social position. Social media users shared the incident as proof that character mattered more than money, and that true authority came from earning respect rather than demanding it through intimidation or privilege. What started as one wealthy man's cruel prank had evolved into a global conversation about respect, tradition, and the true meaning of strength under pressure. The incident proved that in an age of instant communication and social media accountability, character matters more than ever before, because actions have consequences that extend far beyond the moment they occur. Reynolds had learned this lesson the hardest way possible, while Blackwood had demonstrated it with quiet dignity that would be remembered long after the viral videos stopped trending. The moment Kevin Reynolds chose to spit on Thomas Blackwood, he thought he was buying $50 worth of entertainment, but he actually purchased a masterclass in consequences that would destroy his privileged world forever. His wealth had always protected him from accountability, but this time he had crossed a line that money couldn't erase or influence couldn't soften. Reynolds faced 200 hours of community service, frozen assets, and a reputation that no amount of money could repair, while Blackwood became a symbol of dignity under fire. Blackwood's restraint proved that true strength isn't about retaliation, but about maintaining your principles when someone tries to strip away your dignity. As the guard had said in that moment of quiet authority, "I don't expect an apology, but I do hope that someday you'll understand what happened here." What would you do in Blackwood's position? Let us know in the comments below and subscribe for more stories about tradition and duty.